I'm Charlie Garinger,
Robert Santiago.
I'm Jacob Smith.
and we're interviewing Justice Janine Geske today on May 21st in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. All right, so Justice Geske, first question is, where did you grow up and what was your household like?
I grew up in Cedarburg, Wisconsin. I had a brother and my parents, and I lived with them right downtown Cedarburg. My parents were both school teachers in Cedarburg.
So as you look at children now, what changes have occurred in your life that you wish you saw as a child?
Well, one of the things that I saw later on is the increase of diversity in communities and in schools. And when I was growing up in Cedarburg, it was primarily a white community and primarily Christian. And so I think that's been a substantial change. One of the sad things, of course, I think that's happened in my lifetime is to watch the rise in violence in our communities, particularly among children and kids. And I grew up in a time that was pretty safe, and there was very little crime. And the worst thing that happened was that maybe there was shoplifting or some minor offense, but there were no serious crimes, and there really weren't serious problems with drugs as well.
So growing up in Cedarburg, what was grade school like? Were the teachers a lot stricter, and would you consider yourself a good student?
Well, I don't remember my early grades. My report cards seem to indicate, my parents saved them, that I was a good student. I think one of the pressures was that my father taught in the grade school in 6th grade, so I always had a parent looking over me, or if anything happened at school, my parents would hear about it, and my mother taught at the high school. I had a good childhood. I enjoyed school. I lived within 2 blocks of school, so we were able to walk to school, and I have very fond memories of my early years and my friends in Cedarburg.
So as you go back to Cedarburg now, how much has it evolved since you were a child?
Cedarburg has become much more a suburb of Milwaukee. When I was growing up, my grandfather lived in Milwaukee, and it was a big deal if we were going to drive to Milwaukee and go pick him up and have him come for the day, or for us to go into Milwaukee. It was pretty rare that we'd make that trip. And almost everybody that lived in Cedarburg went to the Cedarburg schools, and so it was a very close-knit community. The other difference in Cedarburg is now it's become a bit of a antique kind of destination, and when I was growing up it wasn't that. It was just a very comfortable small town, a lot of farmers from the surrounding area, and just a middle-class community that was a good place to grow up.
So what did children do during their free time in Cedarburg when you were in grade school and middle school?
We played a lot of sports. We played, when I was in the elementary grades, we played a lot on the playgrounds. And as I said, we only lived a couple blocks from school, so we often went there on weekends or later on. There were a lot of sports. I remember playing baseball, and when I got to high school, girls did not compete with other schools, but we had intramurals, so we played volleyball and we had track, there was a movie theater that still exists in Cedarburg, so we'd go see movies, and we just hang out. It was, as I indicated, it was a pretty safe community, so people could go downtown and hang out at the local restaurant and see each other. As kids got older and had their cars, they would cruise around, drive around downtown and kind of be seen by others, but it was pretty insular as a community, and we did not mix much with other towns.
So as you began to talk about the diversity in Cedarburg and playing intramurals rather than playing against other sports as a girl, there are some sports that people now would consider being a guy's sport or a girl's sport, such as baseball. When you were growing up, would you say that there was a clear boundary between what was deemed acceptable activities for girls and boys like there is now?
Well, the boys would compete with other schools. We were in the Braveland Conference, was the name of the conference, and so the boys' basketball team and track and all those competed against other schools in our conference. So the line was really between how much activities and opportunities the girls had versus the boys. We'd play basketball, but just among ourselves. Same with the volleyball, same with the track, and so we just competed against each other. I'm trying to think. There was tennis, but there were both girls and boys. It's just the attention and the money and the resources that were put into the boys' athletics versus the girls' athletics, which was really us just getting together and competing against our friends.
So another thing you started to talk about was visiting your grandpa in Milwaukee. How distant did Milwaukee seem to you as a child? Were you traveling there often for events like Brewers games and things, or Braves and things like that?
It was Braves, Milwaukee Braves. We did come to Milwaukee, but it was a big deal. My grandfather lived close to 33rd and Valete, which is a pretty tough neighborhood now. It wasn't that way when I was growing up, because I remember playing in his yard and in the alley behind the house. But I don't think we saw him more than once a month. And I remember at Christmas time coming downtown to see the department stores and the windows. I mean, it was a big deal. We did all our shopping in Cedarburg or around Cedarburg. I mean, once in a while, I don't think we probably came to Milwaukee more than once or twice a month. And at that time, the freeway wasn't there, so we would drive on Highway 57, and it was a bit of an adventure at that time, and because people just didn't leave Cedarburg.
So when you were in middle school, you said that there was a movie theater. Did you ever go to high school games or movies, obviously?
Yeah, we all went to high school games. I mean, there were the boys' games, of course. They were the competitive games with the other schools, and so we'd always go to the football games on Friday night or the basketball games during the basketball season. I also went to a lot of sporting events because my father was a football referee, and he reffed a lot of conference games and sometimes competitions and even some lower college things, and so I would often travel with my dad. So he made me learn the rules of basketball and football as a young child so I would understand the game, and I'm always grateful for him that he did that for me. But we were all, the community was just involved in the community, and that's kind of the place to go and be seen and to interact with your classmates. And then after the game, we'd all go down to the hamburger place downtown and have hamburgers and hang out for a while and then go home.
So what would that spot be that you'd say would be like the hangout where?
It was a place called Reuters. It's now been a number of other things, but it had sort of a traditional 50s look. It had a counter with stools at it, and then there were small tables and booths. The family that owned it had kids. There was one of their daughters was in my class, and it was the place where everybody would go. There was a drugstore downtown right at the stoplights in Cedarburg, and often we'd go in there as well. But the food was at Reuters, and that was the place we normally went. I remember after I got my driver's license that we actually drove to Glendale to Big Boys a couple times on Friday nights, which is no longer there either. But that was it was a chain restaurant that was really popular, and so we would venture all the way to Glendale sometimes.
So there are stories of people, say, hitchhiking home from school and stuff like that, things that would have been completely normal when you were growing up?
Well, I think boys hitchhiked a lot, although I don't remember people hitchhiking in Cedarburg, but certainly along the highway or outside. I mean, it was very common for particularly boys. I don't remember any of my friends hitchhiking, although certainly there were college-age girls, I think, that during those years were hitchhiking. You don't have the safety concerns. You didn't have the safety concerns that you have now. My husband, for example, who's my age and grew up in a different part of the country, hitchhiked a great deal, and so it was pretty common for people to do it. Cedarburg was so small that a lot of people just walked home from school. And then there were the school buses that would take people that lived further away, or people would get cars when they got to be juniors or seniors. But as I said, boys certainly did hitchhike to go get places, and I'm sure there were boys hitchhiking to get to Milwaukee at times.
So is there anything else you'd like to share about your experience as a child in Cedarburg?
No, I've been, one of the things that as I've worked with a lot of poor communities and people who are struggling, I realize grateful I am for the really the blessings I've had as growing up. I had really the greatest parents, and I grew up in a safe, loving, caring community where I had a lot of freedom and a lot of opportunities, and I realize now that a lot of people don't have that.
So, as you moved on to high school, how noticeable was the difference between middle school to high school?
Well, for anybody, I guess the big difference is that you go from being the 8th grader and the oldest one around to suddenly being the freshman, where you're the low on the totem pole in terms of status. I mean, the classes, just changing classes and being in a bigger building was different. There was this routine in the morning, which is pretty funny when you think back about it, but people would get there and they would walk up and down the halls so everybody could sort of see everybody before the classes. But suddenly we were taking foreign languages, which we hadn't before. We were taking more advanced classes. We had more opportunities for activities after school, certainly, than we had in grade school. And we had to get used to being the young person in the school, which of course changed as you went through the years. But it continued to be a good experience, and frankly, because it wasn't such the whole community. The population when I was growing up was about 5,000 people. So there, most kids knew each other, and so you knew people when you got to high school because you'd been in grade school with them.
So nowadays, kids all have cell phones or laptops and ways to communicate with kids from all over the city and all over the country, really.
Yeah.
What was it like to grow up where you, as you alluded to, pretty much knew everybody in a small town where you weren't really able to reach out to people outside of it?
Yeah, well, you didn't realize that was even a possibility, so you didn't feel deprived about it. I mean, when I was growing up, and I don't know when the change was, but we used to have the telephone on the wall, and earlier on we had a party line, so if our neighbor was on the phone talking, you'd pick up and you'd hear them talking, and so you couldn't call until you figured out that they were no longer on the line. You shared the same phone line. And so it was important not to be on the phone too long. And of course, if somebody called when you were on the phone, there wasn't call waiting and there wasn't an answer machine, there wasn't any of those things. So most of our parents were really crazy about us being on the phone for a long period of time. But people, just like people like to chat through Snapchat and other kinds of social media, we liked to talk on the phone. I think the girls more than the boys did. But certainly, again, it was our insular little world. We were not communicating generally with people across the country. And long-distance calls were expensive. And so you weren't going to make those calls unless there was a really good reason and you were going to keep them as short as possible.
So, again, nowadays, a lot of people coming into high school are kind of scared about the idea of cliques and jocks and bullying and stuff like that. Did you have any of those fears when coming into high school?
I suppose I did. I don't know that I remember that. There was bullying that went on in school. I mean, I remember kids that were picked on for a variety of reasons. And I was always sort of on the edge of things. I wasn't with the cheerleader types and some of the cliquish kinds of groups. But it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't a problem. It just, you just found your own friends. But there certainly were kids that were bullied and treated badly in high school. And when you think back when I think back on those occasions, I wish I'd had more courage to intervene and to do something about it. But it was just kind of the way it was. But I don't think, because we didn't have social media, there wasn't that spread of those things like you have now, whereas everybody's communicating these things. It may be one kid or a couple of kids that say something mean to another student, but it isn't this sort of spreading this bad poison out about a student across the internet and really causing people to go into a deep depression. And fortunately, we didn't have that problem without the social media and the phones.
So you've had 2 kids in high school, or you've had kids in high school. You've had
3.
You've had 3 kids in high school. You've been on the board of directors for Marquette High, so you've seen high school life more recently from when you went to high school. Would you say that there have been changes for the better, or high school's gotten more difficult in the sense of?
I think both. There are changes for the better. I think that the high school, Marquette High in particular, and I hold Marquette High as one of the gems of Wisconsin, has more academic excellence and support for students than when I was in high school. I think that the opportunities to get involved in both volunteer work and other kinds of experiences is greater for kids. And I see even my granddaughter, who just completed 8th grade, went to New York City with her class, and she goes to a Milwaukee public school. Those are kinds of opportunities we never had. We'd take our trip over to Terry Andre State Park, the beach, for our 8th grade trip, but certainly didn't fly to New York or fly to New Orleans or take the kinds of trips that my granddaughter took, or even my children took. I think that the toughest thing that I think that's developed that I see is the proliferation of drugs and exposure to drugs and the viciousness of the drugs that, causing people to overdose and many even to die as a result of use of opioids. I think the social media has both great benefits but also does great harm. And I think that sort of the level of violence and disrespect, particularly now we find in our community, makes it harder to sort of grow up in a high school and be able to treat people respectfully and try to keep that noise out. And so I think those are some of the bad things, but I do think the opportunities and the level of learning is much higher than when I was there.
So you were able to study abroad for a year in Belgium, where there were people from different continents and different countries speaking different languages. How different were these other girls' cultures, and how big of a culture shock was it when you went from a predominantly white, middle-class Cedarburg to a whole different world?
When I went from Cedarburg and flew to Brussels with my grandmother, who did not speak any English, and enrolled it was a public school, but it was a boarding school, so I was boarded during the week and then would come home for a day and a half over the weekend to my grandmother's. It was a cultural shock. It was a social shock. It completely changed the way I lived. The school where I was enrolled was very diverse. There were a number of African young women in part of the school. There were a number of Jewish students. There were some Arab students. And there were Europeans, Belgians primarily. And so that was a whole new experience for me. Suddenly living in a dorm situation when I had only lived at home was also an adjustment of having these regulated study hours and lights out hours and different rules. It was a challenge because I wasn't very fluent in French. When I had 2 years of high school French with my mother, actually, when I went to Belgium. And so when I started the year, I was literally sitting in classes and not sure what class I was in. I'd see numbers on the board and I think, oh, it must be a math class. To, by the end of the year, passing all my exams, and I was actually dreaming in French and thinking in French because I really didn't speak English for a year. I didn't talk to my parents for a year. My grandmother didn't speak English. Once in a while, some of the students that were learning English wanted to speak a little English to me. But it was experientially a transformational year for me, sort of exposing the whole world to me in a whole different way. And I'm very grateful I had that experience because I think my life would have been very different if I hadn't had that opportunity in high school to see a different world and come to some understanding of what happens in the rest of the world when we Americans are sort of insular, particularly my little community was insular in Cedarburg. It was really good.
So how different would you say high school would be there in the sense of how much homework you get each night, how people interact socially, in that sense?
It was very different. They would come wake us up, and I don't remember what time. I'm going to guess like about 6 or 6:30. They would march us in a line from the dorm to the place where we'd eat breakfast. We'd have half an hour or so to eat breakfast. We'd be taken to the school grounds, which was close, and we would have classes almost the whole day. And then we would, after the end of the day, we'd be ushered into a room and had study hall for a couple of hours till we would go and march over to dinner and have dinner. And then we'd go back to the study hall and study a few more hours together. And then they would take us back to the dorm where we would have an hour or so to socialize and to get our stuff ready. And then lights out, we would go to bed. That was a lot of regulation and discipline that I mean, my parents were strict, but I didn't live that kind of life at home. And it took some getting used to. The classes were very challenging, even when I did learn the language. It is not uncommon for a significant percentage of the class to flunk a year, even when they're working very hard. And it's very rigorous academically, and it took some getting used to. But, we had no television. We really had no outside. We didn't have phones. We didn't have any outside communications. So all we really had time was to talk to each other and to study, to eat, and to sleep. And our weeks would go like that. Then when Wednesday afternoons we'd have off, and we could go home. If we wanted to go home, I could take the streetcar to my grandmother's for the half day, but I had to come back, and I had to be checked in with a guard back into the school. And then we'd have class till noon on Saturday, and then we'd be excused Saturday afternoon, and we wouldn't have to be back until Sunday night. So it was pretty regulated. And then I had an opportunity with my grandmother to do some significant traveling in Europe, which was also a wonderful opportunity.
So were you ever able to visit home over, say, Christmas break?
No.
Like that?
Nope. I did not talk to my parents or see them for about 11 months. And at that time, people didn't call from phones. You could go to a post office in Europe, and they would have these phone booths, and you would pay at the desk for so much time, and then they would dial the number for you, and you'd go in the phone booth and call. And you really only did that if there was an emergency. I mean, they were very, very expensive. I just never talked to my parents for a year. We wrote letters continuously. I wrote a lot of letters. My parents saved those. I still have those, and they wrote me, but no, I did not. Over the holidays, I did some traveling with my grandmother. So I got to see some of France and some other countries.
So how would you say that this trip gave you a different view on your lifestyle and other people's lifestyles?
Well, it gave me a comfort level of being with people that didn't look like me or didn't come from my kind of background, meaning people from Africa or people who had faced some really serious discrimination in their lives. I got to see people for people. I mean, they may have looked different and came from different backgrounds, but they were like me in so many ways, and I made many friends during that year. I think it exposed me to a desire to have a bigger life, a bigger world, than just living in the very nice, wonderful town of Cedarburg that I liked. But I like being involved with a variety of kinds of people, and I think it really sort of sent me in that direction and made me involved in some choices later on. I think that may have been different if I'd only stayed in Cedarburg.
So with your mother being a first-generation immigrant, were you able to meet lots of family while you were in Brussels?
Well, my mother was an only child, and so she did not have a lot of relatives. As I said, my grandmother lived in Brussels, and where my mother was born and raised. But there were some cousins and cousins of my mother, and there were some distant relatives that I got to spend some time on. One of the problems is that there are two languages in Belgium. One is French and one is Flemish. Flemish is a lot like Dutch. People in Brussels often speak both languages. My family was actually Flemish, and I never became fluent in Flemish. I understood a little bit. Some of my relatives didn't speak French, and so sometimes I'd go to visit, and we wouldn't be able to communicate very well. Others, some of them knew some English, so we would try to communicate in English. But I did get to spend time with relatives that I wouldn't have been able to see otherwise, and plus I made some really good friends. There's one particular woman who I'm still friends with today, and she became a lawyer as well. She's a Belgian lawyer that I get to see periodically, and I met her in school when I was in high school.
So after your year abroad, you returned to Wisconsin.
I did.
Would you say, was it difficult to return to an English-speaking, white, small-town community?
Well, it was different. The English-speaking, it took me a little bit to get back. I was easier talking to my mother in French. She was fluent in French, but for a little bit. But it came back, and I soon was fine in my English-speaking. It was harder to be with people who had lived in a very limited world when I had experienced so much. So it was hard. It was just hard. It was hard in discussions when people would talk about racial issues or other kinds of issues that I would try to explain what my experiences were like. But if you haven't experienced those things, often it's hard to understand them. And I was glad that when my senior year ended, that I could go off to college and go back to a broader world of different kinds of people.
Do you have any specific memories of high school that you consider important?
Well, I had my mother for 3 years as a teacher, so that was a challenge. I dared not get anything wrong in my homework or in my tests, but again, I had good experiences. I was very involved in almost every organization that you can think of available. I liked being in organizations, I liked the teachers. I knew a lot of the teachers. They were friends of my parents, so I do have some warm memories of learning to drive in high school, and the teacher that taught me how to drive, and I had some really excellent English teachers and a couple of other teachers that I actually stayed in touch with through the years, and so it was a good experience. There was nothing bad about it. I was just real ready to go to college after I'd come back from Belgium.
Were there any lessons that you took away from high school that still affect you today?
Well, it's a combination of what I took from high school and I took from my parents, which was the importance of service. My parents were both really, really good teachers, and to this day I run into people that had them in school and say your dad was the best teacher I ever had, or your mom was the best teacher, or I still know French because of your mom. They were generous with their time. They really cared about their students, and really watching them at that time really sparked a desire in me to want to teach. I think, when I look back at the teachers that were compassionate to students, that were demanded excellence, but yet knew how to support students who were hurting, all that I think helped form me into making the decisions and trying to act like I did when I ultimately became a teacher in different formats. And so it was a good experience. Again, there's nothing traumatic that happened in my high school experience. I feel very blessed. I know a lot of people have had some really terrible things happen to them in high school, and my life was pretty simple.
So both your parents were teachers. Would you say that'd be the leading factor to you originally becoming a teacher? Yes. They were not only just teachers, they were excellent teachers, and I really, that's all when I was growing up, that's all I wanted to be, was a teacher, and I consider myself to this day a teacher, but I've taught different people and different kinds of things, but teaching has been sort of at the core of almost everything I've done. So moving on to college, where did you attend college, and what was it like compared to your life in high school?
Well, it's funny because what I wanted to do, because I was fluent in French by that point, and I was interested in teaching elementary ed, is I wanted to teach French to elementary ed kids. That was sort of what I was going to do. And, and having lived in a pretty small world, I only applied to 2 colleges. One was Beloit College and one was Whitewater. They both had good programs in French and elementary ed. I got accepted in both places. And just sort of a funny story, my mother, my parents said to me, look, because Beloit was a lot more expensive, you can go to Whitewater. If you go to Whitewater, we'll send you back to Belgium so you can see some of your friends from last year and go see your grandmother. Or if you go to Beloit, we can't afford to send you to Belgium. And so I had to make this decision. And I ultimately decided that I wanted to go to Beloit. I thought that the opportunity, the diversity was greater there, and so I decided on Beloit. Well, it turned out there's a national language, it continues to stay, a national language contest for high schoolers, and there's one in French, and I took part in that contest and I won it nationally, which meant I got a free trip to Europe, and I got to study in France for the summer, and I got to go to Belgium, and I got to go to Beloit College. So that was just a fluke, but it was a very nice fluke. So I got to go to Europe, but I liked Beloit. I liked the diversity at Beloit, even though it's a very small school. It's still about, I think, 1,200 students. There are people from all over the world that go to Beloit. Actually, on my floor in the dorm that freshman year, I was the only, I think there was one other person from Wisconsin, even though the school's in Wisconsin. And I really like the level of academics they had and the offerings they had. So I decided to get a bachelor's and a master's of arts in teaching elementary ed there.
Would you say that it was difficult balancing the new freedom and responsibility that you had in college?
Well, I guess I went go through what most kids do. Suddenly although we had curfews, there were still there were girls' dorms and boys' dorms, and I don't remember what they were. I would guess that probably it was either 10 or 11 o'clock during the week, and maybe midnight on weekends. And so, but that was a lot more freedom than I obviously had when I was home and not having to account to anybody. We had our share of parties and wild celebrations, and I enjoyed the freedom. I enjoyed not having to have my parents both kind of looking over my shoulder all the time. I said I probably enjoyed that freedom and partied more than I would normally have done, because high school was I was pretty careful what I did and where I went when I was in high school. I had a chance to go to Europe a couple of times while I was in Beloit, so that gave me some really rich experiences as well, and again, not under the supervision of anybody. So I enjoyed college. The one thing I regret about college, and I was kind of in a hurry to get it done. I wanted to get out and teach, and so I did my bachelor's and my master's in 3.5 years, and that put a lot of pressure on me in terms of academics, and that wasn't a wise decision on my part. I mean, it worked and I got my degrees, but if I were to have gone back, I wouldn't have done that. I would have taken my time and taken the 5 years that it should have taken.
So when you were able to, in college, go back out to Europe, what was that experience like?
Well, there were a couple of them. One was a semester abroad, and it was in Brittany in France, Rennes, France, and I lived with a French family who were just delightful and who I stayed in contact with. It was, they were just really a wonderful family, took me everywhere, really incorporated me into the family, and then I would take a bus over to the university in the morning and take classes. And so, well, let me back up, because between high school and college is when I had that scholarship, so I studied in Grenoble, France that summer, And then a year and a half later, I went to Rennes, to France, with my semester abroad with my fellow students. And then Beloit required that you spent a semester, that you take a job where you're self-sufficient, that your parents didn't help support you at all. It didn't have to be in your major, but you were to try something different. And I got a job working for the NATO school in Brussels, which was a lot of the military families sent their kids there, and there were a lot of international students there. And I was sort of a student intern at the school, and so that was fun. And I lived with that friend of mine from high school in Brussels in an apartment, so that was good. So I had some real nice experiences abroad.
So would you say it was college or high school that you realized that you wanted to become a teacher?
Oh no, I wanted to be a teacher from grade school. The whole time I wanted to be a teacher, and I didn't change when I was in college. Becoming a lawyer never crossed my mind while I was in school.
So when you got out of college, was it difficult to try to find work?
Well, I interned for my master's in Lake Zurich, Illinois in 6th grade, and for a semester, and then they hired me as a full-time teacher, so I completed the next semester, and then another year as a teacher. There was a teacher's strike the following year that was unpleasant, and it was the first time that I started thinking maybe I wanted to do something else. I didn't particularly like the administrators, and thought that they didn't really care about education and cared more about sports, and I started trying to think for the first time, if I'm not a teacher, which is what I'd always planned on doing, and at that point there was a glut on the market of teachers. There weren't a lot of jobs. What could I do? And I knew medical school wasn't going to work. I didn't have any science background, and so, and to this day, I don't know why I thought of law school. I never met a lawyer or talked to a lawyer before then, but I went ahead and took the LSAT exam and applied to some law schools and got accepted and decided to start law school.
So did your parents support your decision to become a lawyer?
Well, they didn't not support it, but they didn't understand it. They didn't understand why, when I'd gotten this education and had my master's in teaching, I would want to leave and start a whole nother law school. I mean, later on, they were very proud of me and excited that I had done that, but at the time, they questioned the wisdom of what I was doing. And, I suppose to them, they didn't understand why I would do that when I already had a career.
Were there any difficulties trying to become a lawyer being a female? Or was it difficult to get into Marquette law?
Yeah, I went to Chicago. I went to a law school in Chicago for a year, and then my second year of law school, I transferred to Marquette. There were 130 students in my class at Marquette. 10 of us were women, so it was not a large number. I can tell you that the women, for the most part, tended to be in the top third or fourth of the class. They were women who had done well academically and were doing well academically that kind of ventured into law school. There's certainly, I mean, we've got stories, there was like almost no ladies' room. There were, some professors would have ladies' day where they'd call on the women. There were those kinds of things in school. But on the other hand, for the most part, I think we felt pretty treated equally. I mean, there were some guys that resented that we were taking up a space for a guy. But for the most part, our classmates were good, and most of us just let that roll off our backs.
So what was tuition like when you were in college, both Beloit and MU?
Well, Beloit had this deal when I went to college that it was guaranteed for 4 years, the number, and so the amount was $12,000 for 4 years. That included room, board, and tuition. So it was $3,000 a year. I don't remember what the law school was, but I do remember that I got a scholarship, a partial scholarship, but I was able to pay all my tuition with the scholarship with money that I had saved from teaching and money I saved from waitressing. which would be impossible today. And my guess it was a few $1,000s a year, but I don't remember what the number was.
So did you ever have to work a job in college, or were you
Yeah, I worked in jobs around campus. I did some babysitting. I worked in the bookstore. I worked in the kitchen at times. I worked banquets as waitressing. I did those kinds of things. Nothing, not a regular substantial job, but enough to bring in money. And most of that money was for my own spending money on campus. My parents paid the tuition and books and room and board, but the rest of it, I had to come up on my own.
So nowadays, when people talk about college life, people start to imagine the kids that skip an entire semester of classes or partying to a dangerous level and things like that. Would you say that was the case when you were in college, or were kids taking classes more seriously?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we had, there were people that didn't show up, that did party too much, that many of them didn't make it. Beloit was also pretty rigorous. The thing is that when I went to Beloit, the classes were very small, and so a class of 40 was a big class. I mean, so it was unusual to have 25 or even 20 in a class. So you were missed when you weren't there, and because we had a good student-faculty ratio, those faculty often would try to track the kids down and figure out what's going on and try to support them. But just like everywhere, there were people that didn't take it seriously, or had addiction problems, or had other problems, and some of them didn't make it. But I think most of the class graduated. Some took a little longer than others, but I think most of us made it.
So, Justice Geske, you were the chief of the staff attorney for the Legal Aid Society of Milwaukee. What does your daily routine consist of, and what was it like working there?
When I started working at Legal Aid, I had, I think, somewhere around 700 clients, and they all had court cases. They were family law and small claims, and anything a poor person could get sued for, I would handle. And so my days were really, I'd go in really early in the morning to try to get some paperwork done, because at 8 o'clock I'd be in the courthouse, and it would not be unusual for me to have 4 or 5 appearances on a given day in different cases, and I would spend most of the day in court, and then at the end of the day I would try to go back to the office and take notes on what had happened and organize myself a little bit for the next day. And so it was actually too busy. I eventually told the head of the office that we had to stop taking so many cases because it was hard. There were times I didn't know who my client was when I walked into the courtroom, and that's not a good way to practice law. So I have a funny story about that. I thought I had to go get a physical for a life insurance policy, and I had somebody else handle it in case I didn't make it. And I raced back to the courthouse, and I asked about a case, and they said, oh, it's in that particular hearing room. And I ran in there, and I represented the guy and said he can't pay child support, he doesn't have any job, and he needs more time, and they gave him more time. And I went back to Legal Aid, and my colleague said, well, I handled your case for you. I have no idea to this day who I represented that day. I just kind of came running into the room. He must have thought I was great. I represented him, got him an adjournment, and got out. So it got a little hectic, but I was able to spend a lot of time in court and a lot of time with clients, and I learned a lot about being poor in Milwaukee and how important a system is for people to have a place where they can be heard.
So what was the transition to Milwaukee County Supreme Court Circuit Judge like? Were there added responsibilities, and how did you get that job? So
from where to where? From repeat it, because you mixed up Circuit Court and Supreme Court.
Supreme Court Judge.
To go from Circuit Court to Supreme Court? Or Legal Aid to Circuit Court?
Sorry.
No, that's all right. It was interesting becoming a judge, because even though I was in court a lot as a lawyer, you never really paid attention closely to what the judge's routine was and how the judge had to conduct certain things and make certain findings. And so there was a big learning curve for me. Fortunately, I had a very good staff that helped me learn. And the lawyers are pretty understanding for a while when you've got a brand new judge to sort of help guide the judge through. But I loved being a circuit court judge. You know, I really worked at trying to have people who were in front of me recognize that I saw that case as the most important case at that moment because that's how they saw it. So I was balancing trying to give people enough time in court and being respectful to them, and yet trying to handle the 40-some cases, and that's what it was in misdemeanor court, that I'd have on my calendar in a day. So I was handling a lot more cases than I was as a lawyer, and I trying to move them along, but yet trying to be respectful of people. Took some work, but I knew how important it was to the parties, so I worked hard at trying to do that.
So how'd you end up getting that job?
I had a mentor at Legal Aid, and one day he asked me if I thought about applying for a judgeship. There was an opening, and I said no. And then he said, well, you should apply for this particular opening. He said, Governor Dreyfus, who was the governor at the time, has not appointed a woman yet. And I think you ought to apply. And I said, I don't have many political ties. And he said, oh, there's no problem. And he picked up the phone and he called the, at that time, Milwaukee Sentinel reporter and asked him who had applied for the job, and the reporter told him. And Tom then said to the reporter, well, Janine Geske's going to get it. And of course the reporter said, who? And he said, Janine Geske's going to get that. And then he hung up and he said, now you have to apply. And so I did. I mean, he kind of pushed me into it, and I campaigned for the appointment, as you do when you're trying to get an appointment. There were 42 applicants for the position, and the governor very graciously decided to appoint me, and so I was appointed and then had to run for election about 8 months later.
So being a judge in Milwaukee, you've encountered many cases that can be considered particularly harsh. Mm-hmm. Would you mind explaining the Ernie Lacy sexual assault case to us?
Yeah, Ernest Lacy was a young Milwaukeean African-American man who had some mental health issues, and he was walking down the street on Wisconsin Avenue, as I recall, and this would have been like in 1981, 81. And the police thought he was, he fit the description of a suspect, I think, in a sexual assault. And they attempted to arrest him. He struggled, and during the course of that struggle, he stopped breathing, and he ultimately died. And there had been an inquest as to whether or not the police officers ought to be criminally charged for their failure to render CPR to Mr. Lacy. And the district attorney decided to issue charges, and I got the case. I was a brand new judge at the time. I'd only been a judge a couple of months. And I looked at the case through the legal eyes that I'm required to do, and I believed that although I did not approve of the way the law enforcement had handled him or what they had done and not done, I didn't believe that their actions fit the criminal statute. So I wound up dismissing the case against the police officers in that case. And, I got death threats after that. I understood why, particularly the African-American community was very angry about that decision, and I tried the best I could when I decided it to try to explain the legal reasoning, but that people don't bother getting into the weeds on those things, and it created marches and quite a bit of turmoil in Milwaukee, and so it was a hard beginning to my judgeship.
So not a lot of people ever get a death threat in their lifetime. Did you take these seriously? Or?
I didn't worry about that. I've had other death threats that I've taken more seriously. I just thought that was people reacting in anger, and I mean, the police department gave me bodyguards, and they came and circled my house and slept in our living room, but I really wasn't afraid during that time. There were other times that it became scarier.
So with difficult cases like this, did you ever come to the realization, or did you ever think about leaving your job because of incidents?
No, no. When you do that kind of work, there's certain risk with it. But I loved my job, and I was careful about where I went, and there certainly was a risk to it, but the risk to a judge is really very small compared to the risk the law enforcement have out on the streets. So, no, I did not reconsider what I was doing. I really enjoyed it.
So another crime you dealt with was that of Luis Santiago. What happened during that trial, and what was it like to have someone put out a contract for your family's life?
Luis Santiago was a young man, a young Puerto Rican, who had run for office in Milwaukee and who was quite well known. He had been sort of the leader of the Puerto Rican community, and then a woman by the name of Aurora rose in prominence in that community, the Puerto Rican community, and she actually established a school. There was a school named after her, and I think that Angel, or Luis Santiago, really resented having her around. I'm sure it didn't help that it was a woman, but he had put out threats against her for some time, and but on one particular day, he had rented a house right across the street from her school, and he had a young gang member, a juvenile, in the house with him that morning, and Aurora was going to the school. It was a little before 8 o'clock in the morning, walking up the steps of the school, and he pulled out a rifle and basically assassinated her, shot and killed her. It was obviously very high profile. Her sons were, at least one of them, if not both of them, were students here at Marquette High. The community was outraged. Santiago blamed the kid, said the kid had done it. But there really was no evidence that the kid had done it, and the kid eventually testified against Luis Santiago, and the kid had no reason to shoot him, just Luis did. And so but he was out on bail during the pendency of the trial, and so we did a 6-week trial. We actually picked the jury in Madison. It was a long, protracted trial. A lot of witnesses were under witness protection because there have been a lot of threats during the trial against witnesses. And at the end of the trial, he was convicted. I took him into custody immediately after he was convicted. And within a very short time, the federal agents came and notified us that there was a contract on my life and on the life of the district attorney and a public defender who'd represented the juvenile, and that we should get out of town. And so we quickly went and pulled the kids out of school, and I warned the neighbors to stay away from our mailbox because the bombing was, firebombs were a way that this particular terrorist group who had put the contract out on our life liked to kill people. And we left town for about a week or 10 days just to get out of town. Eventually the feds said we could come back, and I didn't question too much why it had changed, but we did, and that was sort of the end of it. But that was scary. And it wasn't in a day when we had internet or cell phones, and so I kept calling it very expensive calls back to Milwaukee trying to figure out what was going on and whether it was safe and if they had found anything. But eventually whatever happened, and we came back and I went back to my job.
So how terrifying was this experience compared to?
Well, I worry for my kids and my family. And that was scary, the fact that and it was a serious threat because this group had killed New York City police officers, and in fact there had been a firebomb found in the basement of the house that Luis Santiago had been in, and so that was kind of their MO, is that they would have these bombs that would create these huge fireballs. And it certainly made me nervous, but particularly concerned about my children. I had 3 children with a young baby at that time, and worried about them being safe and not being in a position where they would be harmed.
So after a while on the circuit court, you moved to the Supreme Court.
Right.
What were the situations, or how did that differ from the circuit court?
Well, it's a very different experience to be on the Supreme Court, and I thought long and hard before I applied for the position because I knew it would be different. When you're on an appellate court, you don't see the witnesses, you don't see the police officers, you don't see the parties. All you read, you do a lot of reading. You read the briefs, you read some of the transcripts of what happened below, and what you're really looking at is to see whether the trial court made mistakes and whether those mistakes were substantial enough to result in the case being reversed. But on the other hand, these are cases that are very important. They're the cases that craft and mold the law for the state of Wisconsin. It's the highest court in our state. There are only 7 positions on the court. And so it took some getting used to suddenly having 6 colleagues. You're no longer deciding cases by yourself, you're deciding them in group. And, in the same time after I was appointed, I again had to run for office about 8 months later. So in addition to learning the job and writing opinions, I had to be out on the campaign trail. And now I was not just running Milwaukee County, I was running the entire state. So I was traveling from the northwest corner down to Racine, Kenosha, over to La Crosse, up to Green Bay. A lot of that was during the winter. It was a very bad winter too. So that, it was a tough beginning to both do the job and run the race. But it was interesting work, but it was very different. And I missed the interaction of the people in the courtroom and the vibrancy of the courtroom more than I even thought I would.
So do you think that you helped people more as a circuit court judge, personally, or more?
Well, I think one-on-one, I certainly help people more. You impact more people on the Supreme Court because you are affecting the law that affects everybody. Whereas in the circuit court, you're just deciding the case that's in front of you. I think one of the things I think I brought to that position, I was the only justice from Milwaukee on that court. And since I'd been teaching in the prisons, and I'd worked in the community, and I'd been a legal aid lawyer, and I'd been in the circuit court, in Milwaukee is the busiest county of court activity. I brought all that experience to the conference room, whereas all the other justices were for different parts of the state. So I think I contributed some wisdom and some experience that they didn't have, the other justices. And I'd like to think I made a significant difference in some major cases, but I still like the one-on-one dealing, and I missed that part of it.
So as you began to transition in your career towards restorative justice, what made you feel that Belgium would be a good country to start teaching in, and did this complicate other aspects of your life?
Well, after I left the court, I left the court after a real spiritual quest, and taking a retreat and a couple of retreats and praying over it. And one of the things that was very clear to me after that experience is that I missed working one-on-one with people and interacting with people. That really my more significant gifts lie in that regard. And so I started by doing mediation, and I ran a small claims mediation clinic out of Marquette, which are the Judge Judy cases, and we would get the parties to create some agreement. But then because I'd been teaching in the prison, and I had learned, I saw a restorative justice process and became very enamored with what a transformational experience it was for men in prison and women in prison to hear the stories of victims and community members, and to really reflect on how much we hurt each other and how we hurt each other. That I became, I really, really liked the idea of working in restorative justice. So I started by just doing the volunteer work up in the prison, and then eventually I grew the program and created a program at Marquette Law School. The teaching opportunity in Belgium, the University of Leuven in Belgium has an excellent PhD program in restorative justice. And because I had all my ties with Belgium because of my mother and having lived there, it gave me an opportunity for a semester to teach and to work over there and to really learn from some great scholars. It was an interesting experience for me because it was the first time in my life that I'd lived alone. I'd always lived with somebody, whether it was my parents or my family or somebody, and for me to have my own apartment and to teach and to walk and to be in an ancient city was, I mean, I wouldn't have wanted to do it long term, but it was really a good experience for me. And I think I grew a lot in terms of understanding the work and really understanding why it is that I'm so drawn to it.
Could you just briefly explain what restorative justice is?
Restorative justice is really a philosophical approach to harm or crime. So if somebody has been harmed either by criminal actions or by something else, so if you've been betrayed by a friend or somebody's been discriminated against, or so it doesn't have to be criminal, but somebody's been harmed, it's a way of looking at how you're going to approach it after the harm has happened. And there are these fundamental questions. The first question one asks is, who was harmed by what happened? And so is there a direct person that was harmed? Are people around that person harmed? So if you take a sexual assault survivor, and let's assume it's a woman who was sexually assaulted, you'll find that her partner, her boyfriend, her husband are deeply impacted as well. Her parents, her neighbors, her friends, her colleagues are all deeply affected. So we talk about these ripples around whoever was harmed. If somebody's been betrayed, there are people around the person who's been betrayed that are impacted. Then you look at, so that's who was harmed at one, the victim and people around the victim. Then you've got community, so people that may not know the victim but may be impacted. So if there are a number of crimes in a neighborhood, that whole neighborhood can be impacted. So for example, if there are a number of armed robberies in the Marquette High neighborhood, even though you may not know who the victims are, the kids, the boys that go to Marquette High and even the employees at Marquette High are going to be impacted by it. They're going to act differently. They're going to look at people differently on the street. So there are these ripples in community that happen. And then you look at the offender who's treated differently in restorative justice, but there's an accountability piece. But putting him or her to a side, there are the friends, relatives, and family members of the offender who are also impacted, whether it's embarrassment, whether it's anger. So when you're looking, you look at, first of all, who was hurt, and then you find out what the harm is. And many cases, it's a psychological harm. Even in a sexual assault, I just read an article today where somebody was sexually assaulted, and the article said she's expected to fully recover from her injuries, and I thought, she's not going to fully recover from a sexual assault. She may physically recover, but she's not going to recover psychologically. She's going to be changed. I mean, that's a permanent change in people's lives, and all victims will tell you that. And so you look to see what the harm is for what happened, and sometimes it's economic, sometimes it's psychological, sometimes it's physical. And then you look at ways to help repair the harm, and sometimes it's holding the offender accountable and having the offender do things. Sometimes it's the community helping victims, and so you look at ways to help repair the harm. So the focus is not on the defendant and how do we punish him, but the focus is on the victim and the harm and how do we help repair the harm. And then there are a number of processes. There are victim-offender dialogues, face-to-face meetings, or circles, or community conferencing, family group conferencing. They're all different models of process that you can use to try to accomplish those goals.
So with restorative justice, you've done a ton of work in the community. You've mentioned that you've worked with the Catholic Church over the sexual abuse scandal. Could you explain a little bit of the work you've done?
Sure. I mediated civilly a number of cases with the Milwaukee Archdiocese and victims. And the victims or survivors of sexual abuse are usually meeting with church authorities. They're usually not meeting with the direct offender. Most of the religious who committed those crimes are dead or senile or in denial. So even though I do the victim offender dialogue on a number of crimes, in the church ones, they're often so long ago that the offenders are not in a position to do a direct meeting. But the church itself has also victimized victims, and so we have authorities meet with victims. And so I've sat through many meetings when victims have looked at bishops or archbishops in the face and tell them the harm the church did to them by not listening to them, by moving the offender. by not responding, by challenging the truth of what they were saying originally, and having the church, in some cases, take responsibility for what they'd done. I've also done what we call healing circles, where we take a group of people and use a talking piece around the room to have people relate how the clergy sex abuse scandal has impacted them. And so then you're looking at that wider circle. So it's not just the people who were sexually assaulted, but people that worked at the church where there was a priest assaulting someone are deeply impacted by finding out that the priest was abusing someone. The family members of victims are deeply impacted. The parishioners are impacted, and the ripples have gone to the point where the church has had to pay large amounts of money to victims, which have impacted the church's ability to do other things. So when I do those circles, it's always amazing how many people's lives have been personally touched by knowing somebody who was assaulted, or knowing somebody who was in a position that was deeply impacted by assault. So what you do in those processes are give people a safe place to tell their stories, and then trying to see if there are ways to be able to work towards repairing the harm. You can never close the crime, you can never make it go away, but you can help work on repairing. We call it an ING word, and try to help, whether it's money, whether it's support, whether it's therapy, whether it's providing more support in the parishes. There are lots of creative ways that people have tried to help repair the harm.
Well, again, with restorative justice, there's so many people that you've helped. Is there anyone in particular that you've been surprised about how much progress they've made, or how big of an impact you've had on them?
There is a young man who, when he was a teenager, early teenager, had a very dysfunctional family and was doing very well in high school, and got into a situation where he and another guy were holding someone up at gunpoint to get some money to turn on the electricity, and the gun went off and he killed the person they were robbing. And so he was charged with first-degree murder as a juvenile and waived into adult court. And I met him in prison, and he went to prison as a young man and was doing well in prison. I mean, he's a very smart guy and was doing well academically, and eventually he was moved to a medium security prison, and he participated in our restorative justice work at the prison. And he was eventually paroled back to the community. There was a member of a religious order that had kept contact with him through the years, and so he welcomed him to live in community with this particular religious person, so he had a place to live when he came back, because he didn't have anything. He didn't have a family, he didn't have anybody. And they helped him get a job, and he managed to graduate from one of the universities in town with a 3.9 average. And he has gone on to become a teacher, and he teaches in the community and he coaches in the community, and it's pretty miraculous. It's somebody that took a life of somebody when he was like 14, and he's pretty successful today, and those are stories. I often don't like to give too much detail, because I know that if that became public, there'd be a risk that people would not want him around. And he doesn't hide it, but he certainly doesn't volunteer it. And and so it's those stories. I've done victim offender dialogues with a lot of men who have committed homicides, and a lot of them will say that it's the best thing they've ever done was to sit down and listen to the victim or the family of the victim, and then to apologize and take responsibility for what they did. And they've generally done very well, whether they're still in prison or they're released afterwards, because they see the crime in a whole different light than they did after the court proceeding.
So, being a circuit court judge and having a ton of cases every day, have you ever come across someone that you, through restorative justice, that you had to sentence to prison?
Yeah, a number of times. When the prison program, I've run into the guys, as I say, that I've sentenced, and often I don't know, I don't remember them, and I often tell the story of sitting next to a guy asking him if he's from Milwaukee, and he said, "Yeah, you put me here," which resulted in me not quite knowing what I was going to say next. But he was very nice about it. But there was a particular case with a particular offender. It involved a gang from Chicago that came up and broke into a house of some kids that they thought had robbed their drug house, and they hadn't. But they came in with AK-47 and masks, and they killed 3 13-year-old girls that happened to be in the house. They were in a fetal position, holding each other, and their bodies were riveted with bullets. And then they another young man, so they killed 4 teenagers. And one of the men from Chicago was sort of the gang leader and very cold, and they denied doing it, which is not unusual, but he was just a scary guy. And so when I sentenced him after the trial, I gave him 4 consecutive life sentences plus time for something else. And so he's never getting out. And he was in my circle up in Green Bay one day, and he didn't say too much. He did tell the men on the second day that he wasn't supposed to be in the room and he wasn't supposed to be there, and I was the judge that gave him 4 consecutive life sentences, and I saw all the other men's eyes get really big and worried about it. And then he didn't say much, but he wrote me a letter later, and he said, he was trying to figure out what a right-wing judge like me was doing coming up to the prison. But then he said, I decided that after watching you for 3 days, you really don't want to have more victims. And then he told me that he had really used he'd been in prison for some time already, and he had gone from being a jailhouse lawyer into sewing teddy bears for police officers to give children and crocheting blankets for nursing homes. And he said, I have a lot of bad things to make up for by doing good, and he said, so I'm trying to do that. And then he just wished me well in the letter, and I've seen him a couple times since I've gone to prison. I've gone up there and he's been there, which is pretty miraculous, because I never would have guessed that he was capable of writing a letter or being like that when I saw him in the courtroom. So I still don't think he should get out, but he's doing some good things up there, and I'm happy to see that.
Well, Justice Geske, you've earned tons of awards, including the Thurgood Marshall College Fund Legacy Award, the Norbert College Ambassador of Peace Award, and a ton more. Do any of them stand out to you or make you feel especially accomplished?
Well, it's very nice to receive awards, and I'm very honored by it. I just kind of look at it. I do the work that I really love and I'm passionate about, and that in and of itself is the award that I'm happy with. I guess I've been touched particularly by the Ignatian Awards, the one I received from Marquette High School, and Marquette University has honored me a couple of times, and I think Thurgood Marshall Award, from the Black community is important. But to me, it's what I do. I love the work. I love working in people's lives. It really was what I was looking for when I left the court, is to give an opportunity to walk into people's lives. And I really see God when I interact with people. And the reward is that I'm making their lives a little better than they were before I met them.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
In addition to all we've talked about, I am a mother of 3 children, and I'm very proud of all 3 of them. And I'm a grandmother of an 8th grader, or just graduated from 8th grade, and so and I have just a lovely, wonderful husband who was a Jesuit for a period of time before he left the order. And they enrich my life and support me in so many ways, and let me do the work that I do. If I didn't have a supportive family, it wouldn't be possible for me to be emotionally involved in these cases, and they have always supported me and listened to me, and are my great cheerleaders in what I do, and so I'm very blessed in my family.
Well, thank you very much, Justice Geske.
Thank you.
Good.